Imagine being one of the biggest pop stars in the country, used to millions of screaming fans, only to walk into a tiny village grocery store and have a total stranger tell you to your face that you're arrogant and need to learn some manners. He thought she was a crazy fan playing hard to get. She thought he was just a jerk in an expensive hoodie. But the village of Namhae doesn't care about fame. And neither did she. Here is their secret story. By the time she arrived in Namhae, she had become the kind of tired that lived beneath the skin. Not the tiredness that a good night of sleep could cure, not even the kind that yielded to time. This was the deeper kind, the sort that followed humiliation, betrayal, and the slow collapse of a life she had once defended with both hands. Her suitcase sat beside her on the bus seat like a second body, mute and accusing. Everything she still owned seemed to fit into it too easily. She watched the coastline emerge in fragments through the window. Gray roads softened into curved village lanes. Concrete gave way to stone walls. Then came the sea, sudden and immense, its surface restless under a pale afternoon sky. She had chosen Namhae because it was far. That was the truth of it. Far from the city where she had lost her job. Far from the apartment where she had learned that love could rot quietly while pretending to remain intact. Far from the people who said they were sorry with eyes already moving on. She had not come with a brave heart or a plan. She had come because a distant relative had known of an old house that could be rented cheaply. She had come because she could no longer bear the shape of her own days. She had come because the map placed Namhae at the lower edge of the country, as if the land itself were offering her one last corner in which to disappear. When she stepped off the bus, the wind met her first. It smelled of salt and damp earth and seaweed drying somewhere out of sight. Her hair blew across her mouth. She pushed it away and looked around at a small terminal, a row of parked cars, a bench occupied by two elderly women sharing oranges, and a horizon so open it made her chest ache. No one knew her here. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it made her feel strangely breakable. The landlord had left the key with a woman who ran a small grocery near the main road. The woman looked her over with frank village curiosity, then softened at the sight of her tired face. "You must be the one taking the Yun house," she said, reaching beneath the counter. "It has been empty too long. Houses become lonely too." The remark was so odd and so gently offered that she nearly laughed. Nearly cried too, though she would have denied it if asked. The walk to the house took her past low walls lined with flower pots, fishing nets hanging to dry, and narrow roads that dipped toward flashes of water. Namhae did not unfold dramatically. It revealed itself in breaths, in corners, in little signs of care. Someone had set out bowls of water for stray cats. Someone else had tied ribbons around a persimmon tree bent from old storms. Life here seemed handmade and visible in a way that unsettled her. In the city, pain could vanish into crowds. Here, she suspected, even sorrow would be noticed. The house stood on a slight incline facing the sea from a distance. It was small, older than she had imagined, with a tiled roof and a narrow veranda that creaked beneath her shoes. The key stuck before turning. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and disuse. Afternoon light entered through thin curtains and spread over a floor that needed sweeping. The kitchen was modest. The bedroom barely large enough for a bed and chest. The bathroom had been updated recently, as if someone had decided the old house deserved at least one practical mercy. She set down her suitcase and stood very still. This, then, was her new life. No applause, no certainty, no witness. Only silence, and beyond it, the distant breathing sound of the sea. She opened windows. She swept. She unpacked in pieces, arranging her life with hands that had not yet accepted what they were doing. Clothes in the wardrobe, toiletries by the sink, books stacked by the bed. The game consoles she had almost left behind because keeping them had felt childish when everything else had fallen apart, went under the television in the sitting room. Seeing them there startled her with an old tenderness. Once, she had loved small joys without apologizing for them. By evening, hunger forced her outside. The sky was turning peach and silver above the water. She walked to the grocery, bought instant noodles, eggs, and rice, then hesitated near a rack of cheap slippers. The shopwoman added a bag of mandarins to her things without charging for them. "For the first night," she said. "Kindness, when one has been surviving without it, can feel almost unbearable. Back in the house, she ate at the low table by herself. The noodles were too salty, the eggs slightly overcooked. She finished every bite. Later, she sat on the veranda with one of the mandarins in her palm and listened to the dark gather around the village. Doors closed. Dogs barked somewhere farther up the road. A scooter passed. Then, for a while, there was nothing but the pulse of insects and the sea beyond them. Her phone remained face down beside her. Messages from old coworkers still sat unanswered. Her mother had sent a practical text asking if she had arrived safely, followed by a second one reminding her not to trust strangers. Her ex had written 3 weeks earlier, one final attempt at sounding regretful in a way that cost him nothing. She had not deleted it. She had not opened it again either. Some wounds were too proud to be touched. On her first night in Namhae, she did not weep dramatically. There was no cinematic collapse, no release generous enough to empty her. She simply lay in a strange bed while moonlight moved across the wall and admitted, for the first time without argument, that the life she had planned was gone. The confession left her hollow. But in that hollowness, there was also room. The next morning, the village began to make claims on her. A knock at the gate. The grocery woman's nephew delivering a fan someone thought she might need. An elderly neighbor pausing on the road to ask where she was from, whether she could cook, whether she was married, and after learning she was not, whether that was a grief or a relief. The question was so direct that she nearly laughed. "Still deciding," she answered. The old woman snorted as if this were the only sensible reply. Days moved like that, awkwardly at first. She learned the road to the market, the path down toward the rocks, the hour the fishing boats returned, the exact spot in the kitchen where the roof leaked when it rained hard. She learned that village curiosity was not cruelty, only a form of attention with nowhere else to go. She learned that if she lingered too long examining radishes, someone would eventually ask whether she knew how to choose them properly. She learned that refusing food was taken as tragedy. And slowly, almost against her will, she began to answer when spoken to. Her name sounded different here, softer somehow, less burdened by recent failure. Still, healing did not come nobly. There were ugly mornings. Mornings when she woke already ashamed of being unemployed, ashamed of having run, ashamed of how quickly she had been replaced in the life she used to think was hers. She would stand at the sink washing rice or stare at the sea from the veranda and feel panic rise sharp as heat. What if she had not started over at all? What if she had merely hidden? Yet even those thoughts could not survive intact in Namhae. Someone was always knocking. Someone always needed directions translated, a parcel brought in, a form explained. She had lived abroad long enough that her English was fluent, and word of that spread with almost comic speed. One afternoon, a mother stopped her outside the grocery and asked, with both embarrassment and hope, whether she might occasionally help her son with homework. "It is only that he hates it," the mother confessed, "and when I try, we both become miserable." The honesty of this made her smile before she could stop herself. "Yes," she said, "I can help." It was such a small agreement, hardly more than a favor. Yet walking home afterward, she felt something stir in her chest that had been quiet for months. Not happiness exactly, something gentler. Usefulness, perhaps. The fragile relief of being needed for something that did not involve enduring hurt. That evening, she swept the sitting room more carefully. She stacked books neatly. She untangled the controller cords under the television and laughed under her breath at herself when she realized what she was doing. The house no longer looked abandoned, not entirely. And when night came, she sat again on the veranda with the sea breathing in the dark and let herself imagine, only for a moment, that she might not be here just to recover. She might be here to remain. The first child arrived 2 days later, with a workbook tucked under one arm and suspicion in his eyes. His name was Anew. He was 10, and he stood outside her gate as if approaching a test of character rather than an English lesson. His mother had clearly sent him with instructions to be polite. The instructions were failing under the strain of his nerves. "You really lived overseas?" he asked instead of greeting her. "For a while." "Then your English is like on television." She blinked. "I hope not. Television English is usually terrible." That won the smallest flicker of interest. He followed her inside. At the low table in the sitting room, he opened his workbook with the resignation of a doomed man. She sat beside him, expecting to perform the kind of reluctant tutoring she had once done for cousins during holidays. Instead, she found herself unexpectedly amused. Minyu hated memorization, adored guessing, and approached pronunciation like a wrestler facing a personal enemy. By the time he finally said 3 full sentences correctly, he looked at her as if she had committed sorcery. When the lesson ended, his gaze landed on the console beneath the television. "Do you play?" The question held so much reverence that she almost laughed. "Sometimes." "What games?" She showed him, his expression transformed, not politely, not cautiously, completely. A child's delight, whole and immediate. She had not realized how long it had been since she had seen joy arrive without self-consciousness. "You have all this here," he breathed. For now. For now. I just moved in. I am still deciding what kind of person I am in this house." Minyu considered this with grave seriousness. "You should be the kind with games." By the end of the week, he had returned with a friend. Then the friend returned with a younger sister who needed help with spelling. Soon her afternoons developed a shape. Shoes lined up at the entrance. Backpacks dropped in a heap. Workbooks spread over the table. Groans over grammar. Victories celebrated with tangerines, chocolate cookies, and the reward of 20 careful minutes in a racing game if assignments were finished without protest. The house changed faster than she did. Laughter lodged in the walls. Crumbs appeared in impossible places. She began buying extra juice boxes, then more cushions, then a whiteboard someone's uncle was throwing out. A fisherman's wife sent over kimbap because children learn better when fed. Another neighbor lent her a standing fan. A grandmother who claimed she knew nothing about English brought anchovy side dishes because brain food is brain food in any language. In the city, she had spent months feeling as if she had become excess. In Namhae, she was folded into use before she even understood that it was happening. The children learned her routines quickly. They knew where she kept the pencils, which mug she preferred for tea, and that if they tracked sand onto the floor, she would make them wipe it themselves. They also learned, with the brutal efficiency of the young, when she was sad. One rainy afternoon, the power went out just as a game was loading. The room filled with collective outrage. Then silence. Rain tapped hard against the windows. The children sprawled around the sitting room with unusual stillness, their work already done. "Unnae," one of the girls asked softly, "why did you move here alone?" The question was innocent. It still reached somewhere tender. She looked at their waiting faces and understood that children did not ask to pry. They asked because the world was full of mysteries, and they believed adults could survive being known. "I needed a different life for a while," she said. "Because Seoul is stressful." "Yes." "Because your job was bad." "Yes." Minyu, lying on his stomach with his chin in his hands, said, "Because someone made you cry." The rain seemed to grow louder. She could have lied. Instead, she smiled, though it trembled at the edges. "Yes, that too." No one spoke for a moment. Then the youngest girl scooted closer until her shoulder touched her knee. It was such a small gesture, thoughtless and immense, that she had to look away. After that, the children loved her with greater frankness. They brought her odd treasures: shells, stickers, a tomato from someone's garden, half a packet of seaweed snacks. Their affection did not ask her to be impressive, only present, only kind. It was the most merciful thing she had known in a long time. Through them, the village opened wider. Parents lingered at her gate. Grandparents invited her in for tea. Shopkeepers asked after the children's grades as if she had become partially responsible for the district's academic future. She attended one birthday dinner, then another, and found herself pressed into family photographs by people who had known her less than a month. Every gesture embarrassed and moved her in equal measure. There were still lonely hours. Evenings when the house, after the children left, seemed too suddenly quiet. Times when she stood at the sink washing cups marked with small fingerprints and felt the ache of transient's return. She had not signed a permanent lease. She had not promised anyone she would stay. Some part of her still guarded the right to leave before loss could root too deeply. But the village was patient with that hesitation. It did not demand grand declarations. It simply kept showing up. One Saturday morning, several of the children dragged her down to the shore at low tide to show her crabs hiding between rocks. Their voices rose above the surf. Their sneakers slipped on wet stone. She rolled up her jeans, laughing despite herself as Minu insisted she was city useless and needed training if she intended to survive coastal life. Behind them, the sea spread bright and endless under the sun. She turned toward the village from the waterline and saw it as if from a slight distance. The roofs stepping along the hill, laundry lifting in the breeze, a woman waving from a road above, the children circling her as if she already belonged at the center of their afternoon. Something in her shifted then, not dramatically, more like a knot loosening after being held too long. This place was still new. Her grief was still real. Yet the life around her had begun, in its quiet, stubborn way, to make room for her without requiring that she first become unbroken. When she returned home that evening, flushed from sun and wind, she paused at the gate. The house looked smaller than it had on the first day. Warmer, too. Through the open window, she could see the whiteboard leaning near the table, abandoned pencils in a cup, and one child's forgotten cardigan draped over a cushion like evidence of trust. A house by the sea, she thought, had sounded like escape. But this did not feel like escape anymore. It felt dangerously close to hope. She went inside and set water to boil. Soon someone would come for the cardigan. Soon there would be another knock, another errand, another invitation impossible to refuse without offense. The evening light spread gold across the floorboards. In the kitchen window, her reflection looked softer than the one she remembered from the city. For the first time since her old life had split open, she did not feel as though she were waiting for herself to return. Perhaps this was the return. And outside, beyond the clustered homes and the winding roads and the voices drifting through open windows, the sea kept watch, vast and blue and faithful, as if it had known all along that some hearts arrived at the edge of the world not to vanish, but to begin. By the second month, the children no longer knocked. They burst in with the confidence of those who believed the house belonged, at least in part, to them. She would hear the gate rattle, then the scramble of shoes and voices, and a moment later her quiet afternoon would dissolve into requests for snacks, complaints about homework, and arguments over whose turn it was to choose the game after studying. She had once feared silence because it made room for memory. Now she learned to love noise because it gave shape to her days. The English lessons were never elegant. The children arrived carrying not only school books but moods, bruised pride, sibling grudges, and the exhaustion of being young in a world already asking them to perform. So she stopped thinking of what happened in her sitting room as tutoring alone. She made it a place where mistakes were ordinary, where wrong answers could be laughed at without shame, where trying counted before succeeding. Minu, who had first treated every workbook page like an insult, became the boldest reader once he discovered that confidence could be practiced the same way pronunciation could. She praised effort with enough seriousness that he began to sit straighter when he spoke. Ara, who whispered every answer into her sleeve before daring to say it aloud, gradually lifted her chin. The younger ones turned vocabulary into ridiculous charades. They all improved, but what moved her most was not the grades parents began reporting with astonishment. It was the way the children started to believe they were capable of becoming larger than their own fear. One afternoon, she wrote simple conversation, prompts on scraps of paper, and made the children pair off to speak only in English for 5 minutes. "I can't," Ara said immediately, face paling. "You can," she said gently. "It does not have to be perfect." "What if I sound stupid?" The room went still. The others were listening, because children always recognize the shape of their own fear in someone else's voice. She crouched beside Ara's chair. "Then you will sound like someone learning. That is not the same thing." Ara stared at her, then very quietly nodded. When the exercise ended, the room buzzed with chaotic triumph. Terrible grammar had been committed. Verbs had suffered. Half the children had dissolved into laughter midway through, but they had spoken. They had tried. Ara's cheeks were pink with effort and pride. "You were brave," she told her. Ara gave a shy smile that seemed to light her from within. That evening, after everyone had gone home, she stood alone in the kitchen rinsing cups and felt a sudden tightness in her throat. She had come to Namhae thinking her usefulness had ended elsewhere, in offices and ambitions and careful plans now lost to her. Yet here, in a little house with salt in the window frames, she was helping children become less afraid of themselves. The tenderness of that nearly undid her. The parents noticed the difference, too. They said thank you too often and with too much food in their hands. Rice cakes, side dishes, persimmons, mackerel wrapped in newspaper. She protested at first, then learned that refusal only wounded people determined to love through feeding. So she accepted, and in accepting, entered more deeply into the web of exchange that held the village together. Soon her house was no longer merely the place where children studied. It became the place where they gathered after bad school days, after arguments, after little heartbreaks invisible to adults in a hurry. She listened to stories about playground betrayals and teacher unfairness and friendships repaired over shared chips on her floor. She did not always advise. Sometimes she only listened. Sometimes that was the greater gift. In helping the children find confidence, she found some of her own returning in quieter clothes. Belonging announced itself through routine. It was in the market Ajama who began saving the freshest spinach for her because you look like you forget vegetables when sad. It was in the elderly man who fixed her gate latch without being asked, then stayed for tea and an hour of stories she only half followed. It was in the women who called her over while sorting anchovies and made room for her knees among theirs as if she had always sat there. Namhae did not welcome her all at once. It gathered her slowly, the way the tide gathered scattered things and left them shining together. She learned who baked too sweet, who gossiped too freely, who could be trusted with keys, who cried easily at dramas, who had lost a husband, a brother, a child, and still got up every morning to sweep the front step. The village was full of people carrying grief without spectacle. There was comfort in that, not because pain became small, but because it was treated as ordinary enough to survive. Some evenings she ate alone. More often now, she did not. "Come for dinner," one neighbor would call from the road. "Take soup home," another insisted. "Why are you cooking for one like a tragic heroine?" an auntie demanded, waving her into a courtyard full of smoke and laughter. She went because resistance was futile, and because the alternative had begun to feel genuinely lonely. She sat cross-legged among families that had known one another for decades and found, to her own amazement, that she was no longer introduced as the newcomer every time. Increasingly, she was simply her name. The children sealed what the adults began. They shouted for her in public, dragged her to school events, argued over whether she preferred chocolate or vanilla, claimed her attention with the entitlement reserved for people one trusts not to disappear suddenly. Through them, every lane in the village held some small connection. A mother waving from a scooter, a grandfather pressing chestnuts into her hand, a little boy calling out an English sentence he had practiced all week, beaming when she applauded from across the street. There were moments when the sheer sweetness of it frightened her. To be folded into a community after expecting only refuge was almost harder than loneliness had been. Loneliness demanded little. Belonging asked for the courage to care back. It made future loss imaginable. It made departure a wound rather than an option. One Sunday, she helped prepare food for a memorial table at the home of a family who had begun treating her like an unmarried niece. She was clumsy with some of the rituals, corrected 3 times on the placement of chopsticks, and laughed at with affection each time. Later, while washing dishes in the courtyard, she listened to the older women trade stories of marriages, births, debts, betrayals, and impossible children. The intimacy of their complaint and devotion, braided together, moved her in a place beyond language. Family, she thought, was not always the people who shared your blood. Sometimes it was the people who noticed when your porch light did not come on. When she returned home that night, someone had left a bag of pears at her door. No note, no need. She stood there holding the bag by its handles and felt the truth settle gently and irrevocably inside her. She had come to Namhae trying to escape the shame of being left behind. Somehow, in this small village by the sea, she had become someone people looked for. His return announced itself before he appeared. Not officially, not with cameras or headlines, with energy. The village became subtly brighter with anticipation, as if everyone had remembered a role they once played and were preparing to step back into it. Someone at the market mentioned that Mrs. Kang's son would be visiting after many months away. A grandfather at the harbor muttered that famous people still needed mothers cooking. The children, less restrained, spoke in excited fragments about music videos, sold-out concerts, and whether fame changed the way a person walked. She listened with mild interest and very little context. She knew, vaguely, that one of the village sons had become successful in entertainment. She knew his family owned a well-liked home in one of the older lanes. She knew the aunties loved him with the ferocity reserved for local boys who had gone far but still came back bowing properly. Beyond that, she knew almost nothing and cared even less. Celebrity existed to her as a distant weather system. Loud, unavoidable, irrelevant. It was the children who dragged her nearest to the storm. "Come with us," Minyu begged one afternoon, hopping with impatience at her gate. "They said he might stop by his mother's place today." "I have no reason to go stare at a stranger." "He is not a stranger. He is from here." "That makes him stranger, actually. I know everyone else." The children groaned at her cruelty, which only amused her. In the end, she went not for the rumored star, but because Mrs. Kang had invited her several times for tea, and she had promised to stop by with a tin of cookies she had found in the market. The Kang house was warm before she even entered. Voices, laughter, the smell of broth and sesame oil. Mrs. Kang greeted her with delighted scolding for not visiting sooner and pulled her inside before she could remove her shoes properly. Family photographs lined one wall. In some, a handsome teenage boy with bright eyes grinned beside cousins on the beach. In newer ones, he wore stage clothes and a professional smile that looked expensive and faintly unreal. "So that is him," she murmured. Mrs. Kang beamed. "My son." Before she could answer, the front gate opened again. Footsteps crossed the yard. More voices. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, everyone's attention bending toward the entrance. He stepped inside with a baseball cap low over his brow and sunglasses still on, though the day was overcast. Tall, broad-shouldered, beautiful in the practiced way of men who had been told so often it had become part of their posture. Yet fatigue clung to him too, visible in the set of his mouth when he thought no one was watching. Mrs. Kang rushed forward, touching his arm, his face, half laughing already on the edge of tears. He removed the sunglasses. The children nearly vibrated. Introductions blurred. Hands reached for his bag. An aunt complained he was too thin. Another pinched his cheek as if fame had not bought him immunity from maternal violence. Through all of it, his expression moved between fondness and endurance. The look of a man returning to a love that did not ask permission to overwhelm him. Then his gaze found her. She was standing near the kitchen doorway, holding the cookie tin like an idiot. For one beat too long, he simply looked. His attention was sharp, assessing, and mildly wary, as if he were flipping through a familiar catalog of possibilities and not liking what he found there. Mrs. Kang said her name brightly and explained that she was the young woman helping all the village children with English. His eyes flicked to the children clustered behind him, then back to her. "Ah," he said. Only that, but there was something in the tone, a smugness perhaps, or suspicion. She straightened. "Ah." One corner of his mouth moved. "You must have heard a lot about me." The room was too full, too happy, too noisy for anyone else to notice the insult buried in his politeness. But she felt it land. She stared at him, very little actually. The children made strangled sounds somewhere behind his shoulder. Mrs. Kang laughed, thinking this banter. His brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Really?" "Yes," she said, matching his tone. "I knew there was a son. I did not realize he came with so much self-regard." Silence flashed between them, brief and electric. Then one of his cousins barked out a laugh. Mrs. Kang swatted the air and ordered everyone to sit before the food got cold. The moment dissolved outward into movement, but not entirely. She could still feel it, bright and irritating, like static across the skin. During dinner, he was charming to everyone else. Filial, attentive, good with the elders, patient with the children, almost offensively competent at being adored. Yet once or twice she caught him glancing at her with narrow curiosity, as if trying to determine what performance she was attempting by not joining the others in being impressed. Which, she realized with growing annoyance, meant he thought she was pretending not to know who he was. The arrogance of it. When she finally rose to leave, Mrs. Kang pressed food containers into her hands. At the gate, while the others were distracted, he stepped out behind her. "You really do not know me?" he asked. The question might have sounded wounded, if not for the pride hardening it. She shifted the warm containers against her chest and looked him over in the fatting light. "Should I?" For the first time, he looked genuinely caught off balance. Then he recovered, too quickly to be innocent. "No, it is just unusual." Perhaps Namhae is good for unusual things. His gaze held hers. Up close he was even more irritatingly striking, all clean lines and tired eyes and a mouth made for either arrogance or apology. At present, she saw no sign of apology. Behind them, the house rang with family voices. The children called his name. The sea wind moved through the lane carrying the smell of salt and dinner smoke. He gave a small huff that might have been amusement. "You are very blunt. You are very presumptuous." Something passed over his face then, not anger, interest though he wore it reluctantly. She inclined her head with formal politeness sharp enough to cut and walked away before he could answer. Her pulse felt absurdly fast. She blamed irritation entirely. Behind her, she sensed rather than saw him remain at the gate, watching. By the time she reached her own house, the food containers had warmed her hands through the plastic. The sky above Namhae was deepening into indigo. Lights flickered on along the lanes. Somewhere down the road, children were still shrieking with excitement over the star who had come home. She set the containers on her kitchen table and stood very still. He thought she was a fan trying to act indifferent. She thought he was an arrogant man, too, accustomed to admiration, to imagine the world could meet him untouched by it. The judgments came easily. What unsettled her was how alive she had felt in those few sharp exchanges. Annoyance, yes, but not only that. Something more dangerous because it glittered beneath the irritation. Recognition, perhaps, though of what she could not yet say. Outside, the village settled around his return like water adjusting to a stone. Nothing was the same, not quite. She felt it in the air. And though she would have denied it aloud, she knew as she stood alone in her house by the sea that this home she had been learning to love had just shifted on its axis. Because he was here now. And somehow, against her better judgment, that seemed to matter. The problem with a small village is that it possesses no blind spots. If she walked left, she ran into his mother's praises. If she walked right, she encountered the children debating his shoe size. By Tuesday, she felt entirely besieged by the ghost of Kang Do-hyun before the man himself even crossed her path again. When he finally did, he was sitting on a low plastic stool outside the harbor grocery, wearing a black hoodie that cost more than her entire 3-month lease and peeling a mandarin with long, ridiculously neat fingers. He looked entirely out of place among the rusted fish crates and stacks of dried seaweed, yet the local aunties passed him by with casual pats on his shoulder, which he received with a practiced, easy grin. The grin vanished the moment he spotted her. "The English teacher," he said, tossing a piece of peel into a small plastic bag beside him. He didn't stand up, which she immediately filed under Exhibit A, terrifying lack of manners. "I hear you've turned Minyu into a scholar. His mother thinks you're a miracle worker." "Minyu works hard," she said, stopping a polite distance away. She had a bag of coarse sea salt under her arm and every intention of keeping this brief. It doesn't take a miracle to notice when a child just needs someone to listen. Do-hyun tilted his head up, the brim of his cap shading his eyes, but she could still feel the heavy weight of his scrutiny. "Is that what you do? Listen." "Among other things. I also teach them that the world doesn't revolve around a single person, no matter how much attention they get. A slow, wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was the kind of smile designed to soften interviewers and disarm critics, entirely smooth and entirely hollow. Ouch! Was that aimed at the children, or was it a specialized lecture for me? If the shoe fits, Mr. Kang. Do-hyun, he corrected easily, leaning back against the brick wall of the grocery. We're a small village. Mr. Kang belongs to my father's ghost or the tax assessor, and for the record, I don't think the world revolves around me, just the charts. The casual arrogance of it made her fingers tighten against the plastic bag of salt. He said it like a joke, but the underlying truth was there. He lived in a reality where numbers and praise validated his existence. A reality she had explicitly fled because of how quickly it discarded people when those numbers dipped. Charts must be very comforting, she said, her voice dropping its polite edge. They don't talk back, and they never tell you when you're being tedious. She turned on her heel before he could offer another slick retort. As she walked up the incline toward her house, her face burned with a mixture of irritation and an unsettling, sharp heat. He was exactly the kind of man she despised. Someone who wore his privilege like a second skin and assumed every woman in his orbit was merely an audience member waiting for an encore. Do-hyun watched her retreat up the narrow lane, her straight back and stiff shoulders radiating absolute disapproval. He popped a mandarin segment into his mouth, chewing slowly. Interesting. In his line of work, he had encountered every type of reaction imaginable. There were the screamers, the criers, the quiet starers, and the ones who pretended to be completely oblivious while their hands trembled as they held out a receipt for an autograph. But this woman, this city exile with the tired, guarded eyes and the sharp tongue, was playing an entirely different game. A reverse psychological approach, he muttered to himself, dusting off his hands. It was clever, he had to admit. By treating him like an annoying insect, she ensured he would remember her. In an environment where everyone from his primary school doctor to the lady selling rice cakes treated him like a fragile national treasure, her blunt hostility stood out like a beacon. She wasn't just indifferent, she was aggressively indifferent. It was too rehearsed to be genuine. The next afternoon, he decided to test his theory. He timed his walk past her house for precisely 4 o'clock, the hour the children usually spilled out of her gate. True to form, the yard was chaotic. Minyu was executing a clumsy victory dance on the veranda while Ara carefully packed her books. When she stepped out onto the porch to hand Minyu his forgotten pencil case, she caught sight of Do-hyun leaning against the stone wall across the road. He wasn't wearing his sunglasses today. He wanted her to see him clearly. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying over the sound of the wind. The children immediately swarmed him, abandoning her porch like sailors leaving a sinking ship for a luxury liner. Do-hyun handled them with practiced ease, high-fiving Minyu and answering 3 questions about his latest music video without breaking eye contact with the woman on the veranda. She didn't come down to the gate. She stood by the creaking wooden pillar, her arms crossed over her chest, watching his performance with a cool, unreadable expression. "You're doing it again," he said later, after the children had finally scattered down the road toward the beach, leaving the lane quiet once more. He walked over to her gate, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "Doing what?" "The look, the one that says I'm an environmental hazard." He leaned his forearms against the wooden post of her gate, tilting his head. "You know, if you wanted an autograph for a friend or for yourself, you could just ask. You don't have to invent a whole personality based on hatting me." For a second, she didn't react. Then, a small, genuine sound escaped her, a dry, incredulous laugh that had nothing to do with polite banter. "An autograph," she repeated, stepping down from the veranda until she was at the other side of the gate, looking up at him. "Mr. Kang, Do-hyun, let me make this beautifully clear to you. I do not want your autograph. I do not care about your streaming numbers. I don't even know the name of your last album. To me, you are simply a very loud disruption to a very quiet village where I am trying to live in peace." Her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly devoid of the soft, reverent light he was used to seeing in people who looked at his face. And furthermore, she added, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, your mother is far too lovely a woman to have raised someone this desperately insecure about his own relevance. She clicked the latch of the gate closed between them, a small, physical barrier that felt absurdly final, and walked back into her house without looking back. Do-hyun stayed at the gate for a long minute, the sea breeze catching his hair. His heart was thumping against his ribs with a strange, erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with the stage. She wasn't acting. The realization hit him with the force of a cold wave. She genuinely, truly did not give a damn about who he was. And for the first time in 5 years, Do-hyun found himself completely, utterly at a loss for words. The rains that hit Namhae in late autumn did not fall gently. They arrived with a heavy, driving wind that blurred the horizon and turned the village lanes into small, rushing streams. Yuna was at the low table in her sitting room, drying the wet floorboards where a window frame had leaked, when a heavy knock rattled her front gate. It wasn't the rhythmic, impatient thumping of the children. It was sporadic, muffled by the downpour. When she pulled open the door, Do-hyun was standing under the narrow overhang of her roof, his shoulders drenched. He wasn't wearing his cap or his sunglasses. His hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water down his face, and he was holding a heavy plastic tarp under one arm and a toolbox in the other. Your roof, he said, his voice competing with the sound of the storm. My mother saw the plastic flapping from our lane. She said the corner over your kitchen wouldn't survive the night. Yuna stared at him, her hand gripping the edge of the door. You came out in this. I was the only one home with functioning knees, he said, a brief, dry flash of his usual humor appearing before a shiver caught his shoulders. Are you going to let me in, or do you want to inspect my manners on the porch? She stepped aside immediately. For the next hour, there was no celebrity in her house. There was only a man with calloused hands, hands that Yuna realized, watching him work, had probably helped his father repair fishing boats long before they ever held a microphone. He didn't complain about the dust in her attic crawlspace. He didn't look around her modest rooms with judgment. He simply worked, his knuckles bruising against an old beam as he secured the tarp, his mouth set in a line of quiet, stubborn focus. When he finally climbed down the wooden ladder, covered in cedar dust and streaks of old soot, Yuna handed him a clean towel and a hot mug of barley tea. He took the mug, his fingers brushing hers. They were ice cold. He sat on the low veranda step, staring out at the sheet of gray water covering her yard, his shoulders slumping in a way she had never seen before. The practiced posture, the expensive, fluid grace, had vanished. He looked small. He looked like someone who had been running for a very long time and had finally run out of room. The charts are empty, he said quietly, his voice barely louder than the rain hitting the tiles above them. Yuna sat a few feet away, her knees drawn up to her chest. What? You said they were comforting. They are. He took a slow sip of the tea, the steam rising between them. They're just loud. If you're number one, you spend every second terrified of becoming number two. If you're number two, you feel like a failure. You live your life in a room full of people who only love you as long as the light stays green. He turned his head to look at her. Without the makeup or the stage lights, his eyes were incredibly dark, ringed with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that Yuna recognized instantly. It was the same tiredness that had lived beneath her own skin when she first arrived off the bus. I came back here because I thought I could remember what my own voice sounded like, he whispered, but everyone treats me like a ghost or a prize. He gave a small, fragile smile. Except you. Yuna looked away, her chest tightening with an unexpected, sharp ache. The anger she had held against him collapsed all at once, leaving behind a strange, hollow space that felt dangerously like understanding. He wasn't an arrogant god. He was just a person who had built a very high wall to keep from being broken, only to find himself trapped inside it. Namhae is good for that, she said softly, watching a drop of rain run down the side of his mug. It doesn't care about walls, it just waits for them to rot. Do-hyun let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, leaning his head back against the wooden pillar. Then I suppose I'm in the right place. The storm, the lanes of Namhae didn't change, but the spaces within them did. They began meeting at the edges of the day, during the hours when the village was either too sleepy or too busy to notice. It started with an accidental encounter at the rocky pier at dawn, where the fishing boats were just cutting their engines through the mist. Then it became a deliberate choice, a walk along the old stone path behind the persimmon orchards after her lessons ended, and before his mother expected him for supper. Away from the village eyes, Do-hyun changed. He didn't wear the expensive black hoodies anymore. He borrowed his father's old plaid shirts, his long wrists sticking out of the frayed cuffs. He walked slower. He learned the names of the children who came to Yuna's house, asking how Ara's pronunciation was improving or whether Minyu had finally mastered his verbs. "You're good with them," he said one evening as they sat on the stone wall overlooking the cove. The sky above them was a bruised purple, the sea below steady and dark. "My mother told me what you did for the presentation day. She said she hadn't seen the village children stand that straight in years." "They did it themselves," Yuna said, her fingers tracing the rough edge of a stone. "They just needed to know that if they fell, the floor wouldn't laugh at them." "I wish I'd had an English teacher like you," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When I went a soul at 16, I didn't know how to speak to anyone. I spent my first 6 months in the trainee dorms repeating lines from television so the others wouldn't mock my dialect." Yuna turned her head to look at him. The wind was pulling his hair back, exposing the clean line of his jaw. "Did it work?" "No," he said, a real, unpracticed laugh escaping him. "I just sounded like a very polite robot from the provinces. It took me 3 years to realize that the things they wanted me to change were the only things that were actually real about me." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers settled over hers on the cold stone. His palm was warm now, rough from the work he'd been doing around his mother's house. Yuna didn't pull her hand away. The touch was simple, devoid of the high drama of her past or the careful calculations of the city. It felt like the village itself, handmade and visible. "Why did you leave Seoul, Yuna?" he asked, his voice dropping until it was just a thread in the wind. It was the first time he had used her name without a title or a smirk. Hearing it in his voice made her throat tighten. "Because I let someone else tell me what I was worth," she said, her eyes burning as she stared down at their joined hands. "My job, my relationship. I spent years trying to be the perfect version of what they wanted. And when I couldn't carry it anymore, they just dropped me. They didn't even look back." Do-hyun's fingers tightened around hers, his thumb moving slowly over her knuckles. "Then they were fools." She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no performance in them now, no guarded distance. Only a quiet, heavy sincerity that made her heart skip a beat before settling into a deep, rhythmic thrum. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he said, his mouth curving into a small, wistful line. "One of us ran away because everyone was watching, and the other ran because no one was." "Are we running?" she asked. He shifted closer, his shoulder pressing against hers, cutting out the cold sea breeze. "Not anymore," he said. "I think we're just arriving. A small village does not have secrets, it only has delays." The first sign came from the market Ajama, who added 3 extra portions of braised beef to Yuna's container with a heavy, deliberate wink. "Men who work on roofs need meat," the old woman said, not looking up from her chopping block. "Especially the ones who used to be skin and bones on television." Yuna's face flooded with heat. "Halmione, it isn't like that." "Of course not," the woman snorted. "And the sea is made of barley tea. Go on, take it before it gets cold." Then came the children. Minyu arrived for his lesson on Thursday with a highly suspicious expression, spending more time staring out the window than at his workbook. "Do-hyun has a new song coming out next month," the boy said casually, tapping his pencil against the table. "He told me yesterday when he was helping my uncle with the nets." Yuna didn't lift her eyes from her gratting. "Did he?" "Yes, he said it's a quiet song. He said he wrote the melody while sitting on an old stone wall." Minyu leaned in, his eyes wide with 10-year-old gravity. "Unnai, do you like quiet songs?" "Minyu, page 42. Read," she commanded, though her heart was hammering against her ribs so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The real shift, however, happened on a Saturday afternoon at the harbor. A delivery truck had dropped off 3 large crates of textbooks Yuna had ordered for the winter term, and she was attempting to haul the first one up the incline by herself. Her sneakers slipped on the wet asphalt, the cardboard tearing slightly under her fingers. Before she could adjust her grip, the weight vanished. Do-hyun had taken the box from her arms, lifting it effortlessly against his chest. He was wearing his cap again, but he hadn't bothered with the sunglasses, and his face was bright from the exertion of walking up from the pier. "I told you I'd help with these," he scolded, his voice clear and untroubled by the open road. "Do-hyun, drop it," she whispered fiercely, looking around the harbor. 3 elderly fishermen stopped mending their nets. The grocery woman stepped out onto her porch. 2 mothers walking back from the school paused near the lane. The entire community went still, their eyes moving from Do-hyun's broad shoulders to Yuna's flushed face, taking in the easy, familiar way he stood in her space, the way his elbow brushed her arm as he shifted the box. There was no shouting, no cameras, but the air grew thick with an immediate, collective knowing. It was the kind of attention Yuna had spent months avoiding, an accounting of her presence that felt absolute. Do-hyun didn't back away. He looked out over the harbor, met the gaze of the eldest fisherman, and gave a short, respectful nod before turning back to the incline. "Let's go home, Yuna," he said softly. As they walked up the narrow road together, the box between them, Yuna could feel the village adjusting behind them like water closing over a stone. The safety of their secret was gone, replaced by something much larger, much more real, and infinitely more terrifying. The village had noticed. And in Namhae, once you were noticed, you were never allowed to face the storm alone. The piece of Namhae did not shatter with a bang. It fractured under the weight of 1,000 small digital screens. It began on a Tuesday morning. Yuna was hanging her laundry on the veranda when she noticed a stranger standing at the foot of her lane. The man wasn't wearing the practical boots of a fisherman or the patterned trousers of the village aunties. He wore a crisp trench coat, carried a heavy camera bag, and kept his eyes fixed firmly on her gate. By afternoon, the stranger had become 3, then 5. The village's collective knowing had leaked outward. A grainy photo taken by a tourist at the harbor, showing Do-hyun carrying Yuna's textbook crates while looking down at her with an unmistakable, unguarded softness, had found its way onto a major entertainment forum. The caption was simple: "Is Kang Do-hyun hiding a non-celebrity girlfriend in his hometown?" The internet had done the rest with terrifying efficiency. Within 24 hours, they had found her name, her old occupation in Seoul, and the location of the small, tiled-roof house by the sea. "Don't look at your phone, Unai," Minyu whispered that afternoon. The children had still come for their lesson, but they had sneaked through the back orchard path to avoid the men with cameras lingering near the main road. Minyu's face was uncharacteristically pale. "My mom said the people from Seoul are being nasty. She said they don't know anything." Yuna kept her hands steady as she poured their juice, but her phone, sitting face down on the counter, was vibrating so violently it was sliding against the wood. Messages from numbers she hadn't seen in years, old coworkers, acquaintances who had ignored her collapse, were flooding in. "Are you really dadding him? How did you even meet him?" But worse than the curiosity was the backlash. When the children left, Yuna finally flipped the phone over. The comments under the news articles were a sea of sharp, anonymous cruelty. "She looks completely ordinary. Why is an unemployed girl clinging to him? She's ruining his comeback." The very life she had rebuilt, the small joys she had learned to love without apologizing, was being disassembled and scrutinized by strangers who treated her existence like a minor plot point in a celebrity's career. The pressure inside the little house grew suffocating. Yuna pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the pale autumn light. The walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. A soft rattle at the back kitchen door made her jump. She opened it to find Do-hyun sliding inside, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot under the brim of a low cap. He looked devastated. The celebrity armor was entirely gone, leaving behind only a man bleeding from the wounds inflicted on someone he cared about. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice raw. He reached for her, his hands trembling as they gripped her shoulders. "Yuna, I am so sorry. I tried to have my agency take the posts down, but it's moving too fast. They're digging into your past. They're talking about your old job." "Do-hyun, breathe," Yuna whispered, though her own heart was fracturing. "How can I breathe?" He pulled her against his chest, hiding his face in her hair. His grip was almost painful, desperate with the realization that his fame was a contagious wildfire, burning the only clean, quiet thing left in his life. "I did this to you. You came here to heal, and I brought the city back to your doorstep." Yuna closed her eyes, listening to the heavy, erratic thud of his heart. Outside, the distant click of a camera shutter snapped through the lane. The spotlight had found them, and under its intense, blinding heat, the quiet life they had built in secret was beginning to smoke. 5.2. Choosing love in the face of fan backlash. By Friday, the tension in the village had reached a boiling point. Do-hyun's agency had issued a sterile, defensive statement. "The two are merely local acquaintances. There is no truth to the rumors." It was a standard industry lie, a corporate shield designed to appease angry fans and protect streaming numbers. But to Yuna, seeing her feelings reduced to a corporate denial felt like a cold echo of her past. It felt like being hidden away again because she wasn't convenient for someone else's success. She stood on her veranda, staring at the gray sea. The bags of pears and side dishes from the neighbors still sat on her kitchen counter, but the lane outside was empty. Even the children had been kept home today by parents terrified of the media circus. A heavy footstep sounded at the gate. It wasn't a reporter. It was Do-hyun's mother, Mrs. Kang, carrying a modern, heavy garment bag and a fierce, determined expression that Yuna had never seen on the gentle woman before. Behind her stood 3 of the village elder fishermen, effectively blocking the path of 2 photographers who were trying to peer over the stone wall. "Put these on," Mrs. Kang said without preamble, marching into Yuna's sitting room and setting the bag down. Yuna blinked. "Mrs. Kang." "My son is an idiot," the older woman said, her eyes flashing with a maternal rage that was entirely magnificent. "His company told him he has to leave for Seoul tonight to do a press conference. They told him he has to look the cameras in the eye and say you mean nothing to him, or his new album will fail." Yuna's throat went dry. "I understand. His career." "I don't give a rotten mackerel about his album," Mrs. Kang snapped, turning to grip Yuna's hands. Her palms were rough and warm, full of the ancient, stubborn strength of Namhae. "I care about my boy. For 5 years, every time he came home, he looked like a ghost. This month, because of you, he laughed like my son again. I will not let those suits in Seoul turn him back into a product." She pointed to the garment bag. "He is waiting at the harbor pier. The agency cars are there. Go with him." "If I go, the backlash will get worse," Yuna whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "They hate me, Mrs. Kang. They think I'm dragging him down." "Let them think," a deep voice called out from the yard. Yuna looked out to see Halmione standing by the gate, leaning on her cane. "The people in the city think love is something you buy or trade. Here, we know love is what keeps the boat steady in a gale. You belong to this village now, Yuna. If you're going into a storm, you go with your chin up." 10 minutes later, Yuna stepped out of the house. She wasn't hiding behind sunglasses or a cap. She wore a simple, beautiful knit sweater Mrs. Kang had brought, bright white, visible, and clean. As she walked down the incline toward the harbor, she wasn't alone. Mrs. Kang walked on her left. Halmione walked on her right. Behind them, a dozen village neighbors fell into step, forming a moving wall of wind-beaten faces and broad shoulders that completely shielded her from the hovering reporters. At the pier, 3 black luxury vans were idling, surrounded by managers and a small crowd of local fans who had gathered to watch Do-hyun leave. Do-hyun stood by the open door of the lead car, wearing a sharp, expensive suit that looked like a uniform for his execution. His eyes were fixed on the ground. "Do-hyun." Yuna's voice carried over the sound of the surf. He whipped his head around. His eyes widened as he saw the procession, the entire village escorting her down the pier like a shield of old stone and salt. The head manager stepped forward, his face twisting in panic. Do-hyun, get in the car. The reporters are filming. Do-hyun didn't look at the manager. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at Yuna, standing at the edge of the pier, her hair blowing across her face, her eyes holding the same fierce, unbroken steadiness she had used to teach the children to be brave. Wrong answers are still brave answers, she had told them. You only have to be willing. With a sudden, violent movement, Do-hyun turned his back on the agency car. He walked, then broke into a run straight toward her. The crowd gasped. The cameras erupted into a frenzied, chaotic storm of flashes. But Do-hyun didn't stop until he reached her, his large hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping the salt and tears from her cheeks right in front of the entire world. You shouldn't be here, he whispered, his voice trembling, though his eyes were brighter than she had ever seen them. They'll never leave you alone after this. Then let them watch, Yuna said, her own hands coming up to rest over his knuckles. I spent too long hiding from my life because I was afraid of being hurt. I'm not hiding anymore. Do-hyun let out a ragged breath, a beautiful, brilliant smile breaking across his face, the first entirely real smile the cameras had caught in years. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers as the sea wind swirled around them. Behind them, the village aunties cheered loudly, their voices completely drowning out the shouting of the reporters. The managers were pale, the fans were stunned, and the digital screens of the world were lighting up with a story they hadn't expected to tell. It was an ending to their quiet life, yes, but as Yuna looked past Do-hyun's shoulder at the vast, faithful sea, she knew it wasn't a collapse. It was a horizon, and for the first time she was ready to sail into it. 6 months later, the spring air in Namhae tasted of sweet grass and early plums. The media storm had not dissolved overnight. It had rumbled on for weeks, a noisy, frantic cycle of headlines, opinion pieces, and intense fan debates that had eventually, inevitably, run out of oxygen. A public that had been trained to expect apologies from celebrities had been utterly disarmed by Do-hyun's absolute refusal to give one. When asked by a prominent entertainment reporter in Seoul if he regretted his choices, he had simply smiled, that new, unpracticed smile, and said, I only regret that I didn't walk faster. The industry had adjusted, because the industry always favors a force it cannot break. His Quiet album, recorded not in a slick Seoul studio, but in a converted shed overlooking the Namhae Cove, had gone straight to the top of the charts. It turned out the world had been hungry for a voice that sounded like it knew what it was to be lonely, and what it was to be found. Yuna stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning light catch the pale green leaves of the persimmon tree. Her phone sat on the counter, quiet. She still didn't check the comments, but she no longer felt the need to hide the screen face down. The city had lost its power to define her. The gate rattled open. It wasn't a stealthy, hurried entrance through the back orchard path anymore. Do-hyun walked through the front gate in broad daylight, wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a massive cardboard box that smelled faintly of printing ink and fresh paper. They arrived, he called out, his voice bouncing off the wooden veranda. Yuna stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. The new books. He set the box down on the low table with a satisfying thud and sliced the tape open with his pocket knife. Inside were dozens of copies of a beautifully bound English storybook. On the cover, a vibrant, highly saturated illustration showed a little house with a tiled roof sitting on a green hill above a deep blue sea. Below the title, 2 names sat side by side, written by Kang Do-hyun, translated by Han Yuna. Minyu is going to complain about the vocabulary in Chapter 3, Do-hyun noted, picking up a copy and flipping through the crisp pages. He told me yesterday that if I used words with more than 3 syllables, he was going to strike from the racing games. Yuna laughed, taking a book from his hands. Holding it, she felt a profound, quiet weight settle in her chest. It was a physical manifestation of everything they had built out of their broken pieces, a bridge between his world of words and her world of language, rooted entirely in the soil of the village that had saved them both. "He'll read it," Yuna said softly, her thumb tracing the clean white print of her own name. "Ara will read it first, and then she'll shame him into doing it." Do-hyun stepped closer, his arms wrapping around her waist from behind, his chin resting comfortably on her shoulder. He smelled of salt, cedar dust, and the mild soap his mother still bought from the harbor grocery. "My manager called this morning," he murmured against her neck. "They want to schedule a showcase in Seoul for the album release next month, a real theater, proper lights." Yuna felt a brief, instinctive tightening in her stomach, an old ghost trying to rise. But before the fear could take root, Do-hyun squeezed her tighter, anchoring her against his chest. "I told them we'd do it on one condition," he said. "What's that?" "The front 3 rows are reserved," he smiled. "And the tickets are only valid if the holders can prove they know how to choose a proper radish, shell peas in under 5 seconds, or scream an English sentence across a harbor." Yuna turned in his arms, her hands sliding up to frame his face. His gold skin was warm under the morning sun, his eyes completely clear and entirely free of the shadows that had once lived beneath them. "Mrs. Kang will wear her best silk," she warned him, her mouth curving up. "And Halmione will definitely bring side dishes into the theater." "I count on it," Do-hyun said. He leaned down, his mouth meeting hers in a kiss that felt exactly like the life they had chosen. Slow, steady, and full of a quiet, stubborn hope that no longer needed to ask for permission to exist. That afternoon, the sitting room filled with the familiar, chaotic symphony of their existence. Shoes were kicked off at the entrance in a messy heap. Backpacks dropped to the floorboards. Minyu, Ara, and the others swarmed the low table, their eyes wide as Yuna handed out the fresh copies of the book. "Look," Minyu shouted, pointing to the illustration on page 12. "That's the grocery woman's cat, the one with the torn ear." "And look at the fence," Ara whispered, her fingers touching a small drawing of a gate with a fixed latch. "That's this house. That's our house." Do-hyun sat on the floor among them, his long legs tucked up, completely unbothered as one of the younger girls used his knee as a desk to practice her spelling. He looked across the room at Yuna, who was writing the day's vocabulary words on the whiteboard. She paused, looking back at him through the narrow shafts of gold afternoon light dust dancing through the room. The house by the sea was no longer a place where she had hidden to disappear. It was a place where she had been seen so completely that her loneliness had simply run out of arguments. She had not returned to the old life she had planned in the city, because that life had been too small for the person she had become. Outside the open window, beyond the stone walls and the winding lanes where the aunties were currently hanging out their laundry to catch the spring breeze, the sea kept its eternal watch. It rolled against the rocks, vast and blue and faithful, carrying the voices of the children out into the open air. Yuna turned back to the whiteboard, her hand steady, her heart entirely whole. The story they had started at the edge of the world was no longer about escaping a heartbreak or surviving a spotlight. It was about the horizon they were building together, one brave, imperfect, beautiful day at a time.